and now it's recording, and we shall simply say it's the 15th of April, and I'm sitting with David Chandler at his house, number 6 Havelock Place. And David was born
1926, January
1926, and is retired farmer in Ash. And we'll stop. That introduction was given some time ago in 2008. At that point I left a digital recorder with David, and he went on to record excerpts from his memory from time to time over the next few weeks. You may find that some of these are repetitive, but I haven't edited any. They're just, in fact, as he gave them that time ago.
My first recollections are Percy Harlow with a pair of horses pulling a Kent plough, being followed by Jack Sutton, whose horse walked up the open furrow so that the shim scratched the bottom of the furrow, preparing the ground for potatoes. We never had a tractor until the middle 30s, which was an ancient Fordson, which spent most of the day trying to get the thing to start, because it started on petrol and you moved it on to paraffin. At that time we grew something like 25 different varieties, because we had no storage. You had to get rid of them straight onto the market. I can remember them even tipping them on the ground and covering them up with straw in the frost and then picking them up in November. Fortunately, in 1934 we had our first cold store of 100 tons, which later in 36 was made another 100 tons. So we had a total of 200 tons that we could store apples, which was unbelievable because those days nobody knew what refrigeration was like, and I think we were only the fourth people in Kent to have one. And we stored entirely Bramleys in those days, and we wrapped each one in a little oiled paper because we didn't know much about the atmosphere in the store in those days, and we had a thing called scald, which made the outside of the apple brown. As I mentioned, we kept pigs, and I can remember bringing pigs up to Strawn's, the butchers in Ash, and seeing them killed. The cattle, of course, were taken to the Sandwich Cattle Market. The cattle would graze on the water meadows known below the farm as the Wonsum Channel, and they would graze all the summer, and during the winter they were yarded. The reason being is that the ground was too wet for them to run on in the winter time because it was not drained, and we also ran them on straw, which gave us manure. And manure in those days, plus the pig manure, was very critical because that was virtually the only manure we had in those days. The bag manure, other than sulphate of ammonia, was unheard of, so that it was most important to every farmer to have animals to keep the fertility of his land up by using the byproduct. Also below us was an ancient cottage called Providence Cottage, and it was 3/4 of a mile across the marsh, and he lived in it with his wife, and he got his living in the summertime by counting the livestock round him, because everybody had a certain area of grass to keep their animals on during the summer, because it was so essential to better make farmyard manure. And in the winter time he would make little channels to take the surface water off the fields, and then he would fleet, which means he'd cut the rushes out of the dikes between the individual pastures. So it was a full-time job, but a terrible time for his wife because she had a long way to walk, and then she used to cycle up to the village to do her shopping. The apple trees in those days were very high, so you could pick very few off the ground, so they needed long ladders to pick them, something like 21 stales. In fact, I remember getting my pocket money a little later by picking up the apples that fell off and then washing them in water and sending them to market. At that time there was no storage, so the apples were of many varieties, so we could start picking in July and not finish until September, October. And we had something like 23 different varieties. We also grew potatoes, we also grew gooseberries, we also had a few cabbages and sprouts, which were taken to Deal by a van drawn by 2 horses, and he would leave on a Tuesday and a Saturday, and he would take also the potatoes that were grown, and these 2 horses carried on until about 1936, when it was replaced by a lorry, equally still going back to Deal and marketing round the shops. This, of course, is before the time of tractors, but it wasn't long before we started off with an old Fordson, which started up on petrol, and we transferred it onto paraffin. The biggest problem was that we could never start it in the morning, because it would keep on backfiring and encouraging you to start it, and suddenly it would go to life and away you went. But it really was a funny old thing, and of course it was on steel wheels in those days. I first remember of living at the Laurels, Lower Goldston, and as I looked out of my bedroom window there were trees, apple trees, most of the view very high, so you had to have a ladder to pick them. You had pigs at various times running underneath them, because animals in those days was very important, because it gave us the humus, the fertility. We also had cattle, so farmyard animals in a way were the fertility, because we were virtually organic. The only manure we had out of a bag possibly was a thing called sulphate of ammonia, which came from the gasworks. First thing I remember as a young boy is living in the Laurels at Lower Goldston. The orchards were up close to the garden of high trees, needing a ladder to pick the apples. Underneath, at various times during the winter, there would be pigs running, muddling, making a horrible mess. Also, I could see gooseberries, and also we had some pasture because we had some dairy cows. I also remember still horse ploughing in the early 30s, with a Kent plough pulled by 2 horses, being followed up the trench, the open furrow, by another horse pulling a shim to get deeper cultivation. He just scratched the bottom of the furrow because the ground was in preparation for potatoes. The first tractor we had was in the middle 1930s. It, of course, in those days was on steel wheels, so it couldn't go on the road. The biggest problem was getting it started in the mornings, because you started it up on petrol and you then turned it over to paraffin. But the ignition was not very good, and it was particularly on a cold morning, you would take the plugs out and dry them and hope that you could get it to go, but the swinging of it with the starting handle was very, very hard work. I remember my father getting covered in perspiration, but fortunately things have moved on since then. Not until a little later we have tractors that started, and we never had self-starters until after the war, 39-45. We grew something like 20 odd varieties of apples, the reason being is that you started picking the early varieties in July and you finished picking probably in October, because in those days there was no refrigeration. In fact, we didn't get any refrigeration until about 1934, when we put in a very crude cold store with a great big fan in it, and we had to buy a single cylinder diesel engine which plonked away at about 50 revolutions a minute to drive the fan and the compressor for the cool to make the refrigeration work. And this carried on until after the war, the 39-45 war. It was very crude. All we did was read the temperature. We knew nothing about what was going inside, and I remember my grandfather demanding to have a look to see whether the apples were rotting, because up until that time the only way we could store them was in a barn and a building, and by October, November, of course, they were suffering from old age and going rotten. But anyhow, they were Bramleys put in. After the first year or two, we individually wrapped them all in a grease paper, because the problem in those days, not understanding what was going on inside the refrigeration store, we had a thing called scald, and that made the outside skin go brown. At this time, of course, the tractors were on steel wheels, so all the carting, all the fruit was brought in to the barn to be sorted or ready for market. The horses were the main form of transport, because those days tractors didn't have rubber wheels. During this time we had no electricity. In fact, the electricity didn't come through, I think, until about 36 or 38, just before the war. I can remember them bringing it in. So we had to make our own electricity for the house. My father again had a generating plant, and for this cold stores, the engine there had to have a generator put on it to get the electricity to drive the fans. So things were very sort of primitive. But suddenly, once you get electricity, then everything changes. The houses, of course, got lights in them, very minimal lights, just one bulb, and not all of them could afford to have electricity upstairs. There were no heaters in those days, they just had pure lighting. The cottages were all tied. I mean, that meant you had to work for the farm, and if you didn't work, we had powers to push you out even onto the street in those days, but latterly, of course, it changed, that became illegal. But I can remember putting out one old lady on the Preston crossroads, and she stayed there for a fortnight, which gave us, of course, bad publicity. But generally they paid a very low rent for their cottages. They had no water in many of them. They had to bring it in by bucket and take it out. In fact, even in 1951, when I was first married, looking up the road towards the Wheatsheaf Inn, there's a row of cottages of 9, and they had 2 water taps out in the garden. That's the only water they had. Of course, today they have, of course, modern conveniences of hot and cold water, central heating, double glazing. In 1937, we took over Golston Court Farm. We rented it. This made a vast, doubled our area, and we started producing sprouts, cauliflowers, potatoes. We had to produce, of course, fodder for the horses, which is a clover seed, hay, which was undersown in the wheat, so that the seed was put in May, and the wheat stopped it germinating. As soon as we harvested the wheat, then it looked like a grass meadow, and we'd cut it the following year. The problem with fodder was that the clover had knots in it which could stay green, and you pick it up, or then, of course, manually. It wasn't baled, and you put it loose in a stack, and at times they would overheat. We had 1 or 2 fires. We used to have a thermometer, and the thermometer was a great long steel rod which you pushed into the middle of the stack, so you could tell what the temperature was. And I remember one time it got too hot, we cut a hole in it to let the heat out. So in the late 30s, just before the war, having got increased acreage, we had a problem that we couldn't take it all down to deal with the horses, and this time we had a lorry. We started sending it down to Staple, Durlock, and putting it on the train. And in those days we could load the trucks, and the fruit was in round baskets. We'd put them in these covered in trucks. At 6:30 we had to be loaded by 6:30, when the old engine would come in and puff, and the station master, Fred Carnell, would get by because we were still loading late at 6:15. But anyhow, ultimately, of course, the train pulled out with our produce, and believe it or not, in those days it would be in Covent Garden the following morning between 4 and 5 o'clock, ready for sale. So at this time things were changing very quickly. We actually put in a thing called a cutler which weight graded the apples. And we would then pack them into baskets, in these beautiful round baskets in beautiful patterns. We also started in about 1938 putting them, believe it or not, into wooden boxes. But so things were beginning to change, things were getting better. But of course the price during the war rocketed. Like everything else, everything was in short supply. But in theory the apples were controlled by government price control. But of course things do go a little bit haywire at times, and you could sell anything. We picked them up off the ground, put them in old barrels and all sorts of things to get them to market. All very crude compared to the modern day. I mean, the stuff that we were selling in those days wouldn't be good enough for the juice or the cider trade today. The quality of fruit was beginning to rear its head. I remember as a little boy they used to wash the trees, not spray them, with vast volumes of water. And they had these pipes that they pulled all around the orchard, and it was very hard work. But ultimately in the mid-30s we put in an extensive system of underground steel pipes, and they were sort of herringbone through the orchard, and there was a standpipe every 50 yards. And then you had a shorter pipe which you could go from one standpipe to the other and wash the trees. The problem was, of course, that you got rather wet, particularly in windy weather, and the trees being very high, and you had this long lance, trying to reach the top of the trees was almost impossible. And I remember at 3 o'clock I used to take out a jug of tea. I always had a cup of tea at 3 o'clock with masses of sugar in it to give them energy to carry on. But as time went on, we came to, of course, mechanical spraying pulled by a tractor. More about that later. One of the problems of spraying was, of course, they wanted high pressure. So we put in a special pump house with, I think, had 4 great vertical plunging cylinders that forced the chemical down the pipe, having had a mixer tank which you then flowed into the pumping out tank. It was quite a busy job for one man to mix all these things together. The sulphur ultimately became out of popularity because we thought it affected the skin of the cocks and it made it russeted. And of course that is not suitable for today's marketing of fruit. Then the 39-45 war came along, and the prices of apples was restricted. They were graded in by the government to different qualities to decide on different prices we were allowed to charge. Also, there was a great demand, of course, for fruit because the ports were not importing bananas and oranges, so we could have made a lot more money, but obviously we were very restricted. Also, at the wartime, they, in end of 40, we had these great posts stuck up in all our fields, and between the posts they put in wires which I think came from the winding gear of the local collieries to link these posts together, the idea being to stop gliders. And they were a bit of a menace because we were just getting going with tractors and ploughing. We then had a thing called a balance plough, but a chap sat on it, had a ride, and when he got to the end he tipped it up. It was like a V, and then the tractor turned around and pulled it back the other way with the other set of ploughshares. All very slow but very efficient. Also during 1940 the building that we used for packing apples was ventilated by the Germans by cannon fire going through the asbestos, and the holes remained there all during the war along the sides, not on the roof. Also during the war, in one of the cottages we had 4 airmen billeted because they had a dummy airport down on the Wansum Channel, and they laid out a line of lights across the marsh, and one man used to go down there at night and sit inside a little concrete hut. He had a generator and obviously using telecommunications with Manston. And there, when the Germans came over, he used to switch these lights on to try and draw the bombs away from Manston. The result was, I think we only had one bomb dropped on our land, which was a 250 pounder. Also, there was one typhoon came down, crashed and ploughed into the mud, but I think it was dug out in the end to see who the pilot was. He knew to get the pilot out, and also the airframe. As a little boy, well, I was what, 13, 14, I used to take great delight in the Battle of Britain. I looked upon it as an exciting time because these planes would go over and you could see the dogfights. And I remember the very first time the Germans came over. It was one Sunday evening. We were having tea on the lawn. It was a beautiful summer's evening. And these Heinkels came over at about 8,000 feet, so you could see them in a very tight formation. And we didn't know what to do. My brother ran round one way round the house, and I ran round the other, and we met by the back door, not knowing what to do. But ultimately we got very used to these planes going over, and we didn't really take shelter. In fact, we could stand up on our balcony of our so-called back bedroom, which would look across the marshes to Manston, and we could literally watch them bombing because Manston was just on the brow of the hill. And you could see all the bombs bursting and the Germans were coming up and over us. And we just stood there ignoring them because we thought we were safe, which obviously we were because we survived. But the other thing, of course, was chasing parachutes on my bicycle. In fact, I went into a B-17 a little later in the war, which had crashed. And I got there before the Yanks, and I just went in, had a walk round, had a look at the inside and the gore and all the bullets were lying about. I never thought very much of it in those days. In fact, in the end, I did join the Air Force to fly. When I left school in 1942, I had a year and a half at home before I joined the Air Force in August 44 to join the air crew. We lived very well. We had a dairy. We had cows that we milked so we could make butter. Had all the cream we wanted. We had pigs, so we designed a smokery to make bacon in an old outhouse loo. And all you wanted was a bit of oak sawdust preferably, and we could smoke bacon, or we could have fresh pork. We also had a very good gut. We were growing vegetables such as sprouts, cabbages, cauliflowers, onions. So we did very well in that respect of eating. It was wonderful, really. We weren't aware, perhaps, like the people in the cities, where food was obviously rationed. It was with us, but we had all these extras, which made life reasonably very pleasant. And I remember also, as entertainment in those days, we used to cycle to Sandwich to go to the cinema. And when we got there, I don't know how it worked, but we tended to get priority over the servicemen. But anyhow, that was just a sideline. I used to go most Saturday nights to the pictures. Otherwise, entertainment was rather restricted because there was no television. Radio was coming in then in a big way, and these little songs of Run Rabbit Run and the Maginot Line and all sorts of things. I have a tape today playing back these old wartime songs. They really are quite weird, and I wonder how ever I enjoyed them. But anyhow, that was how you lived, and that's how you got entertained. The other thing, of course, during this time, we started getting Landgars, and we had 4 Landgars billeted. 2 were in the cottages with the farm workers, and 2 came from a hostel at Elmston. These girls were able to prune, of course pick, they didn't get mixed up with the cereal harvest or anything like heavy manual labour. They stayed on the fruit all the time. In fact, two of them stayed with us to the very end of the war. In fact, my brother kept up with one of them, I think John Dunn kept up with the other for many years after the war. The other great excitement at that time when I was home, the ricks, the stacks of corn, the corn was binded into sheaves. We stooped it to dry it, and oats had to be out for 3 Sundays so they were nice and dry before they were put in there in the round stack. And Ralph's from Gilton had a great big old steam engine. They'd bring a thrashing machine in, and during the winter we'd have 2 or 3 days thrashing, and they'd go to some other farmer. But the stacks were absolutely full of mice, and you could stand on them just every time they picked up a sheaf. There was nearly always a mouse underneath, and when you got near the bottom there were rats, so they had to have wire put round to prevent the rats running away so you could eliminate them. But it was really a very dirty, dusty job, because the thresher beating the straw or getting the corn out of the ears, there was a mass of dust, and everybody went home like chimney sweeps. But we survived. But the amazing thing was they put the corn in sacks, in quarter sacks as they call it. And I think they weighed 200 weight and a quarter. So you had to be a jolly strong man to pick it up and carry it. And believe you me, the gallery for keeping the corn was very often upstairs, up a little ladder. You had to carry these great sacks up the ladder so that they were out of the way of the mice, because the building stood on what we knew as steadles. They were stone conical blocks, so that the mouse in theory couldn't run up them and get into this building. They really were heavy, and I don't know how people coped with it. Of course the straw came out the back, loose, and you had a special rope which was well waxed, and you bunched this big bundle up, and then you carried it to wherever they were stacking it, quite often into the yard where the animals were. Some of it was outside, but it was very dirty, dusty at the back, because all the dust came out the back with the straw. And underneath we had what we knew as torf, which was all the little short bits, and you had one guy with an old bit of sacking, and he used to bundle it up and take it again into a little shed, because we would use it for food, because the animals in those days we knew as having pies, a very complicated system of feeding, particularly the young stock. You'd mix straw, you'd mix wurzels or fodder wheat, you'd mix molasses, which was a black byproduct of the sugar industry. You perhaps put some oats on it, rolled oats or barley, and then he would carry this in a big basket on his back down perhaps 100 yards to the yard and tip it in their trough. But it really was hard work in those days. The animals were mollycoddled. They had everything done for them, and we'd have a special machine which we knew as a wurzel cutter, where you put the things in, it made them like chips. In fact, I think it's a very good chipping machine. You had to turn this handle, and as a little boy I wasn't strong enough. But again, you see, it was done so they could give the cows a mixture of various sorts of straw. They had straw, they had hay, they would have eaten any sort of waste product we got at that time. So they really were looked after. Of course, the horse came into his element here, because he would take the straw into the yard for them to walk on to make them dung. So the carter was very important in those days. He could open the gate into the yard and stand by the gate, and he'd say to his horse, "Come on," and it would walk through the gate, and then he could shut it to keep the cows in. And the horse, of course, would stand in the yard with the cows, and they didn't seem to worry the cows sort of right round them and trying to pinch the straw. the old horses really were quite docile. But in those days, all the carting was done by a horse with their vans. The tractor and trailer had hardly come in, but it was just beginning to come in those days with long trailers, we thought. Of course, in the harvest field in those days, you had to pitch these sheaves up onto the trailer, and oh dear me. Reminiscences of a young lad in the early 30s. I can remember going down the back path and crossing the road to the pig unit. Now the pig unit were large blacks where they only farrowed them. And I can remember as a little lad of 5, 6 going down and helping the man who fed them. He seemed an old man to me, but anyhow, I went armed with my bucket that I think I must have had down at the Sandwich Bay. And I'd go into his meal house and he would mix me up some bran and sharps in the skim milk because we had the cows and we made butter. And I would go out into the yard and feed the little piglets. The little piglets were drawn from their mother through a little hole in their pen into an outer pen. And I could feed these little pigs quite happily. And I had a lot of curly hair in those days. Then at 9 o'clock, they always had breakfast from 9 to 9:15. I can remember going home with him, and because he ate bread and cheese, and I remember this great big red Dutch cheese, which I'd never seen before, and I used to have a snippet of it. And the other thing I remember, I was talking earlier on about the trees, the apple trees. They were so close together and so high that as lads we used to try and walk from one tree to the other without touching the ground. And this was a particular variety called Beauty of Bath, which had a very flat growth with strong limbs. We could actually climb from 3 or 4 trees from one to the other without touching the ground. Also, of course, I went with my 2 bigger brothers rabbiting. We had an Airedale dog, and I can remember digging out rabbits. It used to take us a morning or 2 because we weren't very big, and it took a long time to dig out the rabbits because of tree roots. And then I had a little 22 shotgun, and we used to have, which would fire a pellet in, not a bullet. And we would try and shoot the starlings sitting in the conker tree in the garden. Sometimes we hit them, sometimes we didn't. But pigeons were our speciality, the big old ringnet, because they were a menace, because they were eating the green stuff as they still do today. But they had too many feathers. We never seemed to be able to penetrate their feathers to kill them. The other thing I remember was, back in all those days in the mid-30s, we had an old man called Strudwick, and he, in the winter time, had a job of scaring the rooks. And my father gave him a single bore, 12-bore single barrel, which he would use to scare the rooks. And he'd go from about 3 little fields, and that was his day's work, working from one to the other. And every morning he used to come to my father's office at sort of 9ish, and he was allocated, I think, 10 shots, bird scaring shots. My father used to say to him, "Ted, what did you shoot yesterday?" Ted said, "Oh, I missed them all. I just scared them, so that's what my job was." Also referring to corn at that time, having no herbicides, we used to have a thing called a York harrow, which was a rather heavy tine thing, and if the ground was very hard, they'd weight it, and they'd pull this across the corn to try and ventilate the soil from being compact over the winter, and also to disturb the seedlings that were coming up amongst it. Back in the 30s, at Golston Farm, we had a rookery over the pond of something like 30, 40 nests, which made a lot of noise, which means they always said that if a farm could afford to keep rooks, it was very prosperous. Regarding rabbits, there are many more rabbits today than there were in those days, because I think we had a thing called a brown rabbit, and he lived in a burrow, so unless you got a nice bank, or possibly the wood stack, and the wood stack was the prunings of the trees, which was put to dry, and then it was chopped up and burnt in the farmhouses. Because I remember as a little boy, because I could have had frost on my bedroom window on the inside, so the houses were quite cold, because there was no electricity until late. So when I was a little boy, there was no other than what my father generated, that just did the lights. So it was pretty cold, but then we wore woolen clothes, and as a young lad, you don't know how cold it was. But today, of course, we have the grey rabbit, and he lives on little holes in the ground, so they're in much greater profusion than they were when we were small, or when I was small. We had woodpeckers those days, the green. I don't remember seeing any spotted. We also had many hares. That the hares would love the open pasture. In the winter time they would sit on the ploughing in a seat, and we would have a shoot once a year on Boxing Day, and we would shoot hares and rabbits. And the other thing we've got very little of now is partridges. In those days we would have had 50, 60, 100 partridges. Now we're trying to establish them and can't do it. We've been putting them down for the last 3 or 4 years, and I think we might have got 2 or 3 partridges. Pheasants I didn't know anything about. Now the farm is full of pheasants for some unknown reason. We're not breeding them, we don't kill them, we never shoot them. So they're totally wild, they're not these reared ones for shooting. We also had a few duck on the ponds, but not many. No, of course today we have a proper duck pond for shooters. There are also many sparrows. Sparrows could always live where you had animals. There's always enough around the stocks for the sparrows to feed. They had great flocks of sparrows, and because of the thatch buildings in those days, that they could make holes in the thatch to breed and get under the eaves of these old wooden buildings. So they've virtually disappeared now, because having very few animals now in yards, there's not that source of food. So they are much in decline at the moment. But nevertheless, there are birds about. We get the field fares in the winter time coming down from the north to eat the apples under the trees, and they come for a couple of 3 months until they've devoured all the fallen apples. Also during the winter we get a thing called a woodcock. He sits around the base of apple trees. Still comes, they're still about today. When I came back in 47, there was a great revolution going on in the farming world. Tractors seemed to be buzzing everywhere on rubber wheels and not on the steels. The only time that we used steels is what we called row crop, when they were in the potatoes, because in those days we were very aware of a thing called compaction of the soil by the rubber tyre. But otherwise, in the orchard we used rubber tyres for mowing, spraying, and generally the horse was being pushed out. But we still kept a horse still for shimming the strawberries, going through the gooseberries, because they were close plants and the tractors had a job to go through them, through the currants. So we kept the horse, I think, until probably the late 60s. But he was just one horse for shimming, and did odd carting, and he would do all the mulching in the winter time, because you could load it up with a load of farmyard manure and go out in the young orchards, and the old wagoner would put the mulch around the tree and tell the horse to go forwards, and it would go up to the next tree, which was a way of making use of the horse. Also, we put in a lot of storage in the next 5 or 6 years, hundreds of tons, and there was great advancement there. We started to understand the way that the fruit ripened. So the great thing was to reduce the respiration. So we started then with a thing called a scrubber. That was a copper-like thing full of lime and water, and we bubbled the air out of the store through it to remove the carbon dioxide, because we wanted to get as much nitrogen in the store and reduce the oxygen, and the oxygen would be consumed by the fruit itself, and then we would ventilate it to get a balance. But then we progressed a stage farther and used bags of lime and put them in the store on pallets in great blocks, which was an advancement. Now, of course, today that's been superseded by mechanical scrubbing, where you push the air through carbon filters, and you had and it was blowing through one carbon filter and cleaning the other, which was a much more civilized, clean way. The oxygen was brought down to 5% or so. Now it's down to below 1, but it's all to do with trying to keep the fruit from ripening. That's all you're doing, is slowing down the process so that it would keep longer. And the other thing we do today is we pick it much earlier. I think it's picked immature, so it's got what we call a better shelf life. It's got more days before it ripens, so we can keep it in the store longer. It keeps on the supermarket shelf more. And because of the supermarket, our 25 varieties have been whittled down after the war. And I think now we're growing about 6, 7, because the supermarkets demand a continuous supply of one particular variety. If they don't get it from England, they get it from abroad. So we're getting less and less varieties. Our currants have gone because of having machinery to pick them. The strawberries have gone because we didn't produce enough with these great big lorries picking up. They want to pick up tons at a time, not just a ton. So it's been a shrinking, all our crops have been shrinking since the 40s. We've been reducing. We are still producing potatoes, which go all for chipping in the local chip shops in East Kent. The cauliflower have gone, the sprouts have gone. Of course, the fodder's gone because there's no horses. And of course, the combine now has come in on the wheat. When I think of my father growing wheat, it survived because it was resistant to the environment it grew in. So I think now we're growing probably 5, 6 times as much in the same given area as he did. But that the modern wheat will only survive provided we give it chemical A, because it hasn't got any resistance to the environment it grows in, which is rather sad. But anyhow, that's how it goes. So the old binder, which I remember in the early 40s, 50s, we used to bind it, which is go along, cut it. It would go up an elevator and go through a knot, and it would discharge these little sheaves out. The problem was that the knotter was always giving trouble. It wouldn't tie up, it would chuck out loose ears, and so that it had to stop and start again. But anyhow, now of course the combine blasts its way through and out comes the cereal as you want it. After the 39-45 war, things changed dramatically on the farm. We were now getting a lot of apples because our farm that we'd bought in 32 in Wingham was coming on stream with a lot of fruit. The land that we were hiring up at Golston Court was coming on. So we had a marketing problem during the war. Of course, it was simple. So then we started sending lorry loads up to Newark Egg Packers in Nottingham. We then opened up into Cowling in Leeds. We also went to Barnett Brothers in Newcastle. Now, when they used to go to Newcastle in the late 50s, it was taken up by C.F. Carnell, who were gouged here down the bottom of Pudding Lane. And to go to Newcastle would take them 3 days, believe it or not. You'd go so far and have a night's sleep. They always stopped at the same bed and breakfast. Then they went what they called tipped, emptied, loaded up with empties, because in those days we used the containers supplied by the wholesaler. We didn't supply empties in those days, so we then converted to bushel boxes, which made it much safer, of course, on lorries to rope on. But anyhow, as time went on, in 1964, the supermarkets began to rear their head and wanted this, that and the other. So we joined Homegrown Fruits in Canterbury, and we're still with a subsidiary of them today called Worldwide Fruits, which is linked with the New Zealand Southern Hemisphere to keep the supermarkets supplied with fruit. Our acreage of sprouts and cauliflower gradually waned. We did manage to keep strawberries going until quite late in the 80s, but otherwise we lost the raspberries, and gradually you came to this modern way of only growing a few crops and growing them in an efficient way. Also at that time, after the war, we became aware much more of quality, colour, and we had, in those days, our soil would be tested every 3 or 4 years to see what mineral it was deficient of, and Elgas of Faversham would mix up the necessary balanced manure so that we could grow a good heavy crop. Also, the mobile sprayer came in, which is about today, where you pulled a trailer. And I can remember in the early or late 40s, we had a thing called an autoblast with this V8 engine on it, and it blew out vast quantities of water. And I got drowned as a sprayer. And yet, you see, I got washed with all the chemicals like metacystox, these organophosphorus, and nobody took any notice. They were quite safe, but of course we know today that that wasn't true. As far as I know, nobody on the farm ever suffered. Other than I said early on, people got sulphur burns pre-39 when they were using hand lances. But otherwise, we seem to have escaped. The trees then suddenly got smaller. The cost of picking, if you got up a ladder and you got 20 stales, and you're tending down on with one hand, so you only pick apples with one hand, you then waste time going up and down the ladder. Whereas today, with the pressure on, you notice that now, excuse me, everybody now, all the new orchards now, if you can't pick them standing on the ground, the apples will literally fall on the ground. This is to reduce the costs considerably. In fact, it's made a remarkable difference. Why we never thought of it in my day, well, we did at the end of my life, but early on, I don't know. The staff have got an improvement as the forklift came in. It meant less heavy lifting, and also their houses were improved now with hot and cold running water. And electricity has come in now properly. And as in the 30s, when it first came through, they had one light bulb upstairs, I think, and cottages never had light at all. So their standard of living improved quite quickly during the 50s and 60s, because partly we had a government grant in those days to put a bathroom in, so that made life easier. But they invariably, because on lean-tos on the ground floor, so you invariably went out of your kitchen to have a bath, which wasn't the best way of going on. But over the years, the houses have been altered generally, and today, of course, they're not tied, and most of them are let to anybody outside because the staff now is so small. We had 30 houses at one time with staff all living in them, but today I don't think there's more than about 8 living in them today. The rest are rented out to somebody, through an agent. So things have changed dramatically because they all have cars. When I think I used to cycle up the little old road down at Goldston in the middle of the road, either on a trike or a little old pedal bike. Now, because of the butchery, cars come down at 40 miles an hour. I get quite frightened of going down it in my own car. But in those days, pre-39, it was very peaceful. I think because then only the Chandlers had only 3 cars. My grandfather had one, Mr. Dunn had one, and my father had one. So you can imagine the road wasn't very busy, other than perhaps the grocer had one, and the baker, and the laundryman, who of course all visited in those days, which of course doesn't happen today. So they were quite well supplied with food, with the grocery. I don't think butchers ever did any he had to always come up to the village because there were 2 butcher shops in those days. In the pre-39 days, we hardly ever went out holiday time. We just roamed on the farm and did whatever we liked, though we were taken out to tea quite often on a Saturday. And they either went into the Fevers in Canterbury or down to Bobby's in Folkestone. But then we went to Foulmead, where my grandfather Hogbin lived, who was my mother's father. And there we could have a ride on a donkey, which of course was rather nice. If we could catch the donkey, some Saturdays we had a donkey ride, some Saturdays we didn't. Otherwise we did our own things on the farm, annoyed anybody, climbed the trees, as they slid down the straw stacks, built all sorts of shacks, went rabbiting, so we were very sort of almost turned out and carry on until the next meal time, because we always came in at meal time because we always seemed to be hungry.